All right. Today is the day where I start recording, or I should say restart recording, Kant stuff. I fell off. So the Transcendental aesthetic is next. And I actually recorded a video. Could end up being better than this video. But the format, especially getting into the more difficult material that I don't know very well, I'm just thinking it's not going to work out. I was reading everything, annotating the book, obviously, and then rereading everything, recording notes for, the purpose of reviewing while I recorded, a video for it, and then tried to record the video with the notes, and then, edited the video and published it. And it's just, I think it's too many steps. And I also have been reading something, the Wollstonecraft, and it's been working out. So, I think I am just going to read through the parts from now on and try to, work through them. Not for, I'm going to read everything first, and I have read most of, the first 150 pages of this multiple times. So yeah, it's gonna be a little bit more actually reading the text as opposed to a 30 to 50 minute video of me summarizing the text in reading passages, just because I think it's gonna work better for me. So yeah, I'm also holding the microphone for the first time. When I read, I have like a mic stand in an arm thing, and when I read, it just gets in the way. And this obviously takes a hand away from me, but I feel like it'll be better for reading and annotating and highlighting and making notes to hold the microphone. And then I can switch it to my offhand if I want to write something or, whatever. Anyway. All right, so I'm just going to get into it. This is page... Gosh. I find the page annotations to be kind of difficult. 59 of the Penguin Classics version that I'm reading. The title is Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. First part, Transcendental Aesthetic, Section 1. Whatever the process and the means by which knowledge refers to its objects, intuition is that through which it refers to them immediately. This is like perception of objects, I would imagine Kant's talking about. And at which all thought aims as a means. So, you have knowledge of an object, and to think about it, you use an intuition to create an idea of it. I think is kind of what he's talking about. But intuition takes place only insofar as the object is given to us. This again is only possible, for human beings at least, when the mind is affected by the object in a certain way. I think he added, for human beings at least, that quote, or that part of that sentence in the second edition. I don't think that was in the first. The capacity, parentheses, receptivity, close parentheses, to obtain representations through the way which we are affected by objects is called sensibility. Okay, so the ability to receive sense data is called sensibility. Okay? Objects are therefore given to us by means of our sensibility. Sensibility alone supplies us with intuitions or experience. I'm saying or experience, Kant doesn't. These intuitions are thought through the understanding. And from the understanding there arise concepts. Alright, so data, senses are given to us through the intuition. The intuition is thought about with our understanding, and the understanding probably assembles, thinks, whatever, does shit to create concepts. But all thought must directly or indirectly, by way of certain characteristics, refer ultimately to intuitions, and therefore, with us, to sensibility, because in no other way can any object be given to us. I think this is kind of important because Kant talks about potential other ways, effectively how God receives stuff or perceives stuff, which could be he could create things through its mind, or some being could create things through its mind. But what Kant is really saying is here, I think, or at least the important point is like all the thoughts that we have are kind of derivative of the sense experience that we're already given. And that's how we come up with concepts and everything else. To continue, the effect produced by an object upon the capacity for representation, insofar as we are affected by the object, is sensation. The effect produced by the object is sensation. Okay. An intuition that refers to an object through sensation is called empirical. Okay, so things that we actually experience, and, thoughts that refer to an object that we gain through experience, those are empirical thoughts. Or intuitions, rather. The undetermined object of an empirical intuition is called an appearance. And I think that, we've talked about this previously, like an appearance for Kant is something that's kind of different than maybe an appearance for other philosophers. It's not like the idea of a thing or things that are just appearing before. It's kind of, I've described this in previous videos a little more, but like I think it's kind of things as they are presented to us are appearances. And Kant would, in previous sections already has said, we don't really know things in themselves. We only know things as they are presented to us, hence the distinction between things in themselves and appearances. And appearances are empirical, whereas like things in themselves are kind of unknowable. And he's kind of saying here that the objects we are presented with, what he says, the undetermined object of an empirical intuition, is called an appearance. Okay, moving on. That in an appearance which corresponds to sensation, I call its matter. Okay, that's like what the stuff in an appearance is made of. But that which brings about the fact that the manifold of the appearance can be ordered in certain relations, I call the form of appearance. Okay, so things which cause appearances to be ordered in certain relations. What he's going to talk about time and space here shortly, but kind of the underlying bases which provide the ability for appearances to be presented to us. Continuing. Now that in which alone sensations can be ordered and placed in a certain form cannot be sensation again. Right, it can't be sensation. It's got to be something else. Consequently, despite the fact that the matter of all appearance is given to us only a posteriori, as experience, its form must lie ready for the sensations a priori in the mind, and must therefore allow of being considered apart from all sensations. Okay, and so what he's saying here is if the matter, the things that make up the appearances and things that are presented to us are given to us through experience, then the thing that allows the matter to be presented to us, i.e. the form, must be underlying that and exist before those things are presented to us. And Kant takes the position that they are a priori in our minds before we actually experience the matter within them. So time and space, yes, time and space are in our minds a priori, and then they are filled with matter, stuff, appearances, things in themselves, although we don't know them, a posteriori. Well, I don't know if he would say that the things in themselves are actually in the forms of... So that might be a little bit too much. Anyway, I call all representation pure in a transcendental sense, in which there is nothing that belongs to sensation. The pure form, therefore, of sensible intuitions in general, in which everything manifold in the appearance is intuited in certain relations, must be found a priori in the mind. I gotta read that again. I call all representation pure, in a transcendental sense, in which there is nothing that belongs to sensation. Okay. So taking sensation out of the equation. The pure form, therefore, of sensible intuitions in general, in which everything manifold in the appearances is intuited in certain relations, must be found a priori in the mind. Okay, why? Thus, if we separate from the representation of a body what the understanding thinks in regard to it, such as substance, force, divisibility, etc., and likewise what belongs to sensation, such as impenetrability, hardness, color, etc., there still remains something of this empirical intuition, namely extension and shape. These belong to pure intuition, which, even without an actual object of the senses or of sensation, exists a priori in the mind, as a mere form of sensibility. All right, so he's separating things that the understanding thinks about a body. So what its substance is, force, divisibility, these would be things that we can conceptualize, think about, calculate, but aren't necessarily, things that we experience in the world. Okay, so he separates that out. Then he separates things that we can perceive through sensation. Impenetrability, that's kind of a tough one, but okay. I don't know if I could perceive that something was impenetrable, but I'm an idiot. Hardness, color. So those are things that we use sensation to actually perceive things. And if we took both of those things away, in a way, those are kind of things that exist within the appearances that we're being presented with, and things that exist for us to experience of the things, the appearances we're being presented with. We're still left with extension and shape. Okay, because these belong to the pure intuition, and even without an actual object of the senses or of sensation, exist a priori in the mind as a mere form of sensibility. Okay, I'm not sure I'm buying that yet. I feel like he's not explaining it yet, so okay. Continue. The science of all the principles of a priori sensibility I call Transcendental Aesthetic. There must be such a science forming the first part of the transcendental doctrine of elements, in contrast to that science which treats the principles of pure thought, and which is called the Transcendental Logic. Okay, so the Transcendental Aesthetic deals with sensibility. The Transcendental Logic is going to pure sensibility, I should say. And the Transcendental Logic is going to deal with principles of pure thought. And the Transcendental Aesthetic is like 10 pages, and I think the Transcendental Logic is about, 450. Anyway. In the Transcendental Aesthetic, therefore, we shall first isolate sensibility. Right, we don't want to be relying on our senses. We want to get down to the forms of things rather than, like, the appearances. By separating from it, he's talking about the sensibility. By separating from the sensibility, I'm adding that in, everything that understanding thinks through its concepts. So things are given to us via intuition. We use the understanding to create concepts, and we want to separate, in this situation, everything that the understanding thinks through those concepts, because we want to get away from sensibility, so that nothing will remain but empirical intuition. Secondly, we shall separate from sensibility everything that belongs to sensation, so that nothing will remain but pure intuition and the mere form of appearances. Which is all that sensibility can supply a priori. Okay, so and this is the dichotomy that he was kind of talking about earlier, 2 paragraphs ago. The things that the understanding thinks about certain objects, and the things that sensibility actually gets from those objects. And he wants to take both of those away, so we're left with, the pure transcendental aesthetic. Okay, sorry, I lost my... In the course of this investigation, it will be found that there are two pure forms of sensible intuition, which are principles of a priori knowledge, namely space and time. We now proceed to consider these in more detail. All right, that's the end of section 1. All right, the Transcendental Aesthetic, section 1 of space, and section 2 of the Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. I don't know. These sections are... I'm not smart enough to figure out the section numbers. Maybe that's an indication that I shouldn't be trying to read this book. I may be referencing stuff. I'll obviously let everyone know. But I have the highlighted version of Gardner's book in front of me as well. In particular when, it might not be this section yet. Okay. Metaphysical exposition of this concept. By means of outer sense, a property of our mind, we represent to ourselves objects as outside us, and represent all these in space. This actually might be a helpful thing to talk about. My understanding is, and I've struggled with this a little bit, is like if you take this very literally, what Kant is saying about, we represent things that are outside of us as outside of us, it's not super helpful. It's kind of just a truism or a tautology. Is that... To be honest with you, I never understood. Tautology is just like a self-evident principle that's not really helpful, right? Let me look that up. I'm an important YouTuber now. I need to check my stuff. Tautology, the saying of same thing twice in different words, generally considered to be a fault of style. Yeah. All right. Anyway. But rather... And I think Victor Gijsbers does obviously he does a much better job of everything, so just go watch that. This is mostly for me. But I think the way to conceptualize this is like through a Cartesian perspective, where Descartes was like saying... his kind of starting point was like, I don't know if anything outside of me is real, and I'm going to doubt effectively everything that I can, and only things that are beyond doubt are going to be accepted in my philosophy. I think what Kant is trying to say here is like, from a Cartesian perspective, we kind of represent things as outside of that doubt, and outside of ourselves as things that are kind of separate and apart from ourselves. I need to firm that up, to be honest with you, because I'll be honest with you, I don't 100% understand exactly the demarcation there. But anyway, in space, their shape, size, and relation to one another are determined or determinable. Inner sense, by means of which the mind intuits itself, or its inner state, yields indeed no intuition of the soul itself as an object. But there is nevertheless a determinate form under which alone an intuition of its inner state is possible, so that whatever belongs to inner determinations is represented in relations of time. So, effectively, Kant splits things up into space and time, right? So space is how we perceive and represent the world outside of us, and time is how we represent the world, the inner world, like the world inside of us. It's pretty confusing, to be honest with you. I think the idea is like, without space, we could not represent anything as outside of us or understand anything as outside of us, and without time, our thoughts would be they kind of exist in a linear kind of march, and therefore they need to be separated by time in a way. if you think about it, the way I like to think about this, and this is, maybe stupid, but like if you think about a physical book in the world, in order to represent that as outside of yourself, like the book has to, just be in the world. Okay, there it is. I go pick it up. Okay, that's an outer representation for Kant of like a matter that's in the world, just an appearance. But in order to experience that book, there's a certain amount of time that you have to spend reading each of the words. And so you can't just pick up the book and kind of, subsume all of the knowledge from it immediately. There's like a definable amount of time that it might be different for everybody, but there's a definable amount of time it takes to read each of the words. And therefore, there's a time associated with actually reading and understanding the book. And in this situation, I think Kant is kind of pointing something similar like that out in our minds. Like, I can't think of the sentence, I don't know, all dogs are brown, until I work through like the time that it takes to have each of those thoughts represented by each of those words. And therefore, like, there's a time associated, but something existing in the world could, hypothetically, it could exist there regardless of time, because it's spatial as opposed to temporal. So that's kind of how I think of this. It helps me. I don't know. Time cannot be intuited externally any more than space can be intuited as something within us. What then are space and time? And here's where Kant really talks about three separate people, or three separate ideas of time, that are kind of popular when Kant was kicking around. And so Kant says, what then are space and time? Are they things which actually exist? That would be Newton's view, is my understanding. Are they only determinations or relations of things, but such as would belong to things even if they were not intuited? Leibniz is my understanding. So space is like relational, and even if space did not exist, in a way, like if two objects existed, effectively there would be a way to define the space in between them. 3, this is Kant's view. The third one. Or are they determinations and relations which adhere only to the form of intuition, and therefore to the subjective nature of our mind, without which these predicates of space and time can never be ascribed to anything at all? And I'm going to switch over to Gardner very briefly to talk about these. And he says, briefly, it's apropos, Newton's view of this space is absolutely real, self-subsistent container, which would exist even if no physical object were contained within it. To which extent space is akin to a substance, since it exists self-sufficiently. Okay. The same holds for time. Alright, so time and space exist kind of independently. Space is kind of a container that just, holds a bunch of stuff. And even if no person, thing, anything was there to perceive it, it would exist because it's an independent object or thing. So is time. The opposite Leibnizian view is of space as a logical construction out of relations between objects. To say that objects are in space is to say that they stand in certain relations to one another. Statements about space can be reduced to statements about objects and their interaction. Another way of expressing, I'm just going to keep reading. Another way of expressing the difference between them is to say that on Newton's view, there are such things as spatial points in temporal instants, which are ontologically irreducible and exist independently of the objects that coincide with them. And that for Leibniz, there are no such entities. So, like, if you think about, coordinates on a plane, Newton would say, yeah, those exist. As, the coordinates exist even if there's nothing on them, like no point on each coordinate. And Leibniz would say, like, no, the coordinates are there, and they're only, helpful or real insofar as they tell us the relationship between two coordinates, 2 points on those, on that plane. Okay. The difference shows up with respect to the kinds of possibilities that each view is able to countenance. It follows from the absolutist view that the universe could shift its position in space, begin to drift in one direction, and could have been created at a different time from that at which it actually came into existence. So it could have just been placed here, created somewhere else and just like placed into existence. The relationist must deny the intelligibility of these suppositions, since like space doesn't exist independently. It only exists when you put shit in it. The absolutist grants the plain possibility of empty space and empty time. The relationist can understand these possibilities, if at all, only conditionally, in terms of possibilities of relations between objects. Okay, he continues. I'm going to just talk about Kant's view really quick, or read Kant's view really quick. Then we'll go back to the critique. Kant's own view of space and time he expresses by saying that they are a priori intuitions. To say that they are a priori is to say that they do not derive from experience. And I think that would be counter to Leibniz, right? Because Leibniz is saying if you have two things relationally, you experience them and then you measure the space, and that's how space kind of functions. It's relational. And to say that they are intuitions is to say that our awareness of them is immediate and non-conceptual. Like intuitions, it's through kind of it being presented to us, and that each of space and time is in some sense a single object. Kant's view differs from those of Newton and Leibniz, for it entails, contra Leibniz, that space and time are irreducible, and also contra Newton that they are not real in an absolute sense. The irreducibility of space and time is what is at issue in this chapter, and their non-absolute reality in the next. Okay, so I think I understand the not real in the absolute sense contra Newton. Irreducible, I think Kant is trying to, Kant's position is contra Leibniz, that space and time are irreducible. I think Kant would say, even if there were two things in space, if there is a relational aspect of space, I think he would grant that to Leibniz, obviously, but you still need a human to intuit that and be presented with that for space to actually be relational. I don't know if that's right or not, but that seems seems plausible for my bird brain. Okay. All right, back to the critique. In order to understand this more clearly, let us first give an exposition of the concept of space. By expositio, then, I mean the distinct, though not comprehensive representation of what belongs to a concept. Such an exposition is metaphysical if it contains that which exhibits the concept as given a priori. Okay, and so these are the kind of famous four arguments that Kant presents. Excuse me, having a drink of coffee. The first two are arguing that space is a priori, and the second two are arguing that space is an intuition. And I think the way that I try to keep these things straight is really okay, a priori, when you're thinking about this, I kind of get in the weeds a little bit too much, and it starts to become confusing. And I try to lean back on the fact that, okay, we're thinking about it. The question is it a priori or is it a posteriori? Like, is space something that exists within us before experience and provides the basis for our experience, like the form? Or is it something that is presented to us with experience? Like, we don't, we don't know about / understand experience space until we experience it. So with that in the background, I'm going to go into the first arguments. Kant says, 1. Space is not an empirical concept which has been derived from outer experiences. For in order that certain sensations be referred to something outside me, that is, to something in a different part of space from that which I am, again, in order that I may be able to represent them as outside and alongside one another, that is, not only as different, but as in different places, the representation of space must already be at the basis. Okay, so in order to refer to something in space, the idea of space must already be there. In a way, it has to precede the idea of the thing, because the thing has to exist in space. Therefore, the representation of space cannot be borrowed from the relations of outer appearances through experience, but on the contrary, this outer experience is only possible through that representation of space. And in a way, it kind of makes sense. Like, if you were to be like, okay, can you measure, and I know he's being like way more philosophical than this, but like, okay, can you measure the distance between like my coffee and my iPod on my desk? And it's like, to even ask that question, like, those things have to exist in space first, right? Like, you can't, get to space, measurement, difference without already kind of experiencing space or understanding space a priori. I think that's kind of Kant's point in its most basic form. I'm sure people have written about this, and it's there's a lot more to it than that, but I'm going to leave it at that and try not to confuse myself too much, because I did like an hour video explaining these, and frankly, I just, probably did more harm than good. Okay, argument number 2. Space is a necessary a priori representation which underlies all outer intuitions. Okay, it is impossible to have a representation of there being no space, though one can very well think of space without objects to fill it. Space is therefore to be regarded as the condition of the possibility of appearances, not as a determination dependent on them. It is an a priori representation which necessarily underlies all outer appearances. Okay. So we learned, in the intro, we haven't read that much yet, that if something can be a priori if it's necessary. Because if it's necessary, it kind of applies to all things and therefore exists prior to our experience of it. So, in its most basic sense, if you know something is universally true, then you don't have to go through experience to determine whether it's true, beforehand. So that's one way that space, that's one way that Kant uses necessary. So I'm just going to reread that and kind of work through it. Space is a necessary a priori representation which underlies all outer intuitions. Okay. It is impossible to have a representation of there being no space. Right. It's just, I don't really need to explain that, but okay, that makes sense. Though one can very well think of space without objects to fill it. Okay, so since you can imagine a world without space, or with space but nothing within it, and I think this is kind of getting to the relational aspect of it. if I don't know, it would seem to work both ways if space were relational. Like, okay, could you have a world with no space if it is truly relational? Because, like, just imagine a world where there's nothing inside of it, nothing populating it. Wouldn't that be possible if space were merely relational? I don't know. Okay, space is therefore to be regarded as the condition of the possibility of appearances, not as a determination dependent on them. Okay, it's a condition. That makes sense. You know, it's a condition for stuff existing in the world. It's not it's not everything exists in the world and then is measured via space. It is an a priori representation which necessarily underlies all outer appearances. All right, I'm going to take a look at the Gardner. And I might take a... I had notes related to this and typed up exactly what I wanted to say, but I accidentally deleted them because okay. The first argument, I'm reading from Gardner, page 75. The first argument is that representation of space must be a priori and not an empirical representation, which has been derived from outer experiences, because it is presupposed for outer experience as such. And then he quotes Kant. Quote, outer experience is possible only through that representation of space. And now he explains the outer thing again, so let's take a second to read that. Gardner says, again, outer does not mean external in a spatial sense, which would reduce the claim that outer objects must be represented in space to a tautology. Yeah, we know that word now. But rather distinct from myself. So things are distinct from my own being. That's what we're talking about. Not things that are existing, outside of myself. He continues, my sensation cannot be referred to something outside me, i.e. distinct from me, unless I presuppose the representation of space. Nor, Kant adds, can my sensations be represented as outside and alongside one another without the representation of space, meaning that space is also presupposed for determining the numerical distinctness of outer objects from one another. Okay? Kant's statement of the argument is compressed, and it is not immediately obvious what form it is intended to take. It cannot rest on the bald premise that in order for experience to represent objects as F, the representation F must be a priori, since that would have absurd consequences. Everything would fall into that. That even the representation of color must be a priori. And in any case, Kant is not arguing that space is presupposed for experience from objects as spatial, but for experience of objects as outer, i.e. distinct from oneself, as well as one another. Kant's argument must rather be the following. If the representation of space were not a priori, it would be empirical. And this is what I was getting to earlier. It's like, keep in mind that there are two options here. So you're kind of choosing one over the other, not just trying to figure out the a priori argument, which is confusing, to say the least. If the representation of space were not a priori, then it would be empirical. But if it were formed empirically, then it would be obtained from experience of outer objects. But this is impossible, since outer experience is impossible without the representation of space. So in other words, if we understood the space as we understand it through experience in the world, we would have to, if space itself were obtained through experience, we would have to understand space before we could understand those relational things, like through experience. But the truth is, we don't necessarily understand space, through experience prior to that. We kind of understand space, relational space, through actual experience, but not space itself through experience. Because that would be crazy, because we couldn't understand relational space without kind of experiencing space itself. It makes sense in my head, but I feel like I'm not explaining it very well. If the representation of space were not a priori, then it would be empirical. But if it were formed empirically, then it would be obtained from experience of outer objects. But this is impossible, since outer experience is impossible without representation of space. And I think the other point he's probably, or Gardner and Kant are probably making, is presumably if space were like purely relational, then I think he's saying like you would be able to experience, you would be able to understand it through experiencing that relationship alone, as opposed to like outside of space. Because like the thought is like if it is just relational, you should be able to through experience, you would have to kind of be able to experience it outside of space if space is not like an underlying a priori thing that is the basis for everything. Otherwise, you can't escape Kant's argument that space is a priori. If you are existing within the form that Kant has said is a priori and already exists, in order to do your relational bullshit, like you've already lost. I think that's the point. I don't know. That makes sense to me. Like you can't do any of the other stuff without experience, like without space already being there. I'm going to just read it again. If the representation of space were not a priori, then it would be empirical. But if it were formed empirically, then it would be obtained from experience of outer objects. But this is impossible, since outer experience is impossible without the representation of space. So the representation of space must be a priori. In sum, because the representation of space is invoked in the very act of representing the world of outer objects, it cannot be based on experience of outer objects. That makes sense to me. Okay. The second argument, this is Gardner continuing, says that although we can think space empty of objects, it is impossible to represent the absence of space. Space must therefore be regarded as the condition of the possibility of appearances, and not as a determination dependent on them. Okay, since we cannot... Okay, this is me talking... since we cannot represent objects in the absence of space, space must therefore be regarded as the condition of the possibility of experience. Okay, that makes sense. And not as a determination dependent upon them. From which it follows that space is a necessary, and therefore, again, an a priori representation. Okay, that kind of makes sense. The point of the second argument, and this is where it really ties my head in the knot. The point of the second argument is to rule out a possibility which the first leaves open. Namely, that although outer objects cannot be represented without space being represented, the reverse is also true, i.e., space cannot be represented without a world of outer objects being represented, as Leibniz's view implies. If the representation of space and an outer world were mutually necessary, then the representation of space would not be prior to the representation of an outer world, which would imply that space is after all an empirical representation. The second argument is accordingly designed to secure the a priority of space by establishing that the representation of outer objects is not necessary for that of space, and it does this by indicating a difference in the behavior of the two representations. Okay. I'm there. I'm as far as I'm gonna get. So let's move on to the third argument. That kind of makes sense. Okay, and so arguments 3 and 4 are related to space being an intuition as opposed to a concept. And I think, we just talked about the definition of intuitions, and I think it's also helpful, similar to how we did in the previous two arguments, if you're gonna, consider a priori as opposed to a posteriori, I think it's also helpful to consider intuition versus concept. And, an intuition is like an experience, an impression, like something that's kind of presented. That's kind of how I understand it. I mean, we can go back to, let's go back and read it. This is the first sentence of the Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. Whatever the process and the means may be by which knowledge refers to objects, intuition is that which refers to them immediately, and at which all thought aims as a means. But intuition takes place only insofar as the object is given to us. So is it like an object that is given to us and experienced, or is it something that we think of, like a concept, that, information is fed through the understanding and then we come up with it? Kant's going to say that space is obviously an intuition and not something, and not a concept. In his argument is really going to be, it functions like, it doesn't really fit into the definition of a concept very well, based on how it functions. Okay, argument number 3. Space is not a discursive, or, as we say, general concept of the relations of things in general, but a pure intuition. For first of all, we can represent one space only. And when we speak of many spaces, we mean only parts of one, and the same unique space. Which is a weird way for a concept. So if you have a concept of a tree and you think of 5 different trees, like you're thinking of different trees, as opposed to you have a concept of space and you think of 5 different spaces, it's technically the same space, right? It's just kind of, now sectioned up into little things, mostly based on like, external things impinging upon it. Nor, secondly, can these parts precede the one and all embracing space as its constituents, out of which it can be assembled. Rather, they are thought only as in it. Space is essentially one, the manifold in it, and therefore the manifold in it. He uses manifold in such a weird way. Like, that's the stuff in space, the manifold in it, and therefore the general concept of spaces in general arises entirely from limitations. Hence it follows that with respect to space, an a priori intuition of it, one that is not empirical, must underlie all concepts of it. In the same manner, all geometrical principles, i.e., that in a triangle 2 sides together are greater than the third, are never derived from the general concepts of line and triangle, but from intuition, and derived, moreover, a priori with apodictic certainty. Okay, so I think what Kant is trying to get at here is, again, like, space operates much more like something that we experience and we can extrapolate things from, and we can chop it up into a million different parts and, figure things out and figure out principles related to it. The same is not true of concepts, right? If you think of tree, you can think of 1,000 instances of a tree, but you can't think of the same instance of a tree chopped into 1,000 parts, and it would all be, it just doesn't function that way. And you also can't, extrapolate apodictic, like certainly true statements based on the concept of a tree. Like, it's, it functions just in space functions just inherently differently. Okay, section 4 or argument 4. Space is represented as an infinite given magnitude. Now it is quite true that every concept must be thought of as a representation, which is contained in an infinite number of different possible representations as their common characteristic, and therefore the concept contains these under itself. And here, this is an interesting thing. Like, space is infinite and can be chopped up in infinite pieces and compartmentalized and whatever, but you can't do the same with a tree. Like, you can have infinite ideas of different trees, like that's certainly true, but it's not the same as the thing as the way space functions in that sense, which sounds pretty similar to 3, but argument 3. Okay, continuing. But no concept as such can be thought as containing an infinite number of representations within itself. Nevertheless, space is so thought, for all parts of space up to infinity are simultaneous. Consequently, the original representation of space is an a priori intuition and not a concept. I think that makes sense. I think like space just in general functions much more like an intuition than a concept. And I'm not going to try to overcomplicate this. I think that's kind of self-explanatory and fine. But I am going to end this here. And yeah, I'm just going to continue reading. I know a lot of people skip over some parts. Actually, let me see what Gardner says about this really quick. The third argument claims that we can represent to ourselves only one space, i.e. that space is unitary, singular, and unique. Kant gives 2 connected reasons for thinking this. Both have to do with the relation of space to its parts. First, to talk about diverse spaces is to talk about different parts of one and the same unique space. Second, these parts cannot precede the one and all embracing space, and can only be thought of as in it. Okay, that makes sense. I mean, that's just not how the concept of a tree works, right? You're not talking about different parts of the all embracing tree, and you also like the different concepts can precede one another, whereas space, it's just always there. The parts of space, Gardner continues, the parts of space, particular spaces such as the space between here and the wall, are not related to space, the dimension of space, in the way that instances of a concept are related to that concept. Instances of the concept of a tree are not similarly parts of the tree. Particularly, spaces are, as Kant puts it, arrived at through limitations of the all-embracing space. We can identify them only by, so to speak, slicing them out of space. Okay. I think I'm fine with that. Let's go on to the fourth argument. This is Gardner again. The fourth argument says that space is represented as an infinite given magnitude, and that this is to be explained by its being an intuition. Kant does not mean that we perceive space as an infinite whole, which we obviously do not, but that space is given to us, first, as unbounded. We cannot represent an end or edge of space. Behind any space lies more space. And second, as infinitely divisible. The product of dividing any spatial volume would always allows for further possible divisions. Division does not terminate with the discovery of granules of space. It is because space is given as infinite in these 2 senses that we represent it as having an infinite number of parts. Carrying over from the third argument, the conclusion that space is unitary, it follows that the possibility of an infinite number of parts of space is secondary to and derivative from the infinity of space itself. Now, a concept cannot be infinite in the same sense. Yeah, and we kind of talked about this. There can be infinite instances, but there can't be infinite breadth of a single concept. The concept of a tree has infinite number of possible instances, but this is not because there is something represented by it to be called tree, which is itself infinite in the sense of having an infinite number of parts. As Kant puts it, the infinite parts of space are contained within it, whereas the infinite possible instances of a concept fall under it. Okay, that makes sense. A concept that did resemble space in containing an infinite number of parts, as distinct from having an infinite number of possible instances, would be one with an infinitely rich content, and would not be grasped by a finite mind. Therefore, space cannot be a concept, which was created by the mind. Concepts are created by the mind. The fourth argument thus protects the conclusion of the third, by showing that the existence of infinitely many instances of space does not, as might be thought, make the representation of space a concept. On the contrary, the fact is explained by its being an intuition. Okay. I feel pretty good about this. Working through it, I like this format. That took about an hour to get through no, we got through 4 pages. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5. And this is pretty dense. So, yeah. I'll try to keep going, hopefully soon. And we'll move on to Section 3, Transcendental Exposition of the Concept of Space. And that's just, page and a half, and then conclusions. I find the conclusions to be kind of complicated. But so is everything else. But yeah.